We're here with Adam Gopnik, writer and essayist, who has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1986. Adam, thank you for joining us here at LSE.
It's wonderful to be at LSE.
So you're here to talk about your new book. It's called At the Stranger's Gate, and it's about your life in New York in the 1980s.
That's right. It's the third volume of memoirs I've written on the basis of being someone who has accomplished nothing in life except writing memoirs. So it's a sort of meta book about someone who's a memoir writer. But it's really about the 1980s in New York, which seemed to me suddenly, in the last few years, now you're all too young to remember the 1980s, we weren't even born then, but it suddenly seemed to me to be a remote time rather than an immediate time. In lots of ways, things that we think of as being the kind of the condition we find ourselves in now, whatever we choose to call it, the neoliberal crisis or something, all began in the 1980s in the period of Reagan and Thatcher, when Donald Trump made his first appearance in the world. And a lot of that is in the book, but it's about how the individual experience of two people, my wife and myself, trying to make their way in the world, was both fashioned by the pressure of that particular political and economic time, and also not fashioned by it in all the ways that our individual experience usually evades and escapes the pressures of historical necessity.
I also want to talk about before in New York. You were raised in Montreal, is that right?
I was raised in Montreal, in Canada, that's right, yes.
So what brought you to New York?
The essential magnetism that brings young people from the provinces to the capital in every period, in every country. We just wanted to see what the big show was like. Montreal is a wonderful place, great city, and Canada is still home. My wife is 37 years later has still not surrendered her Canadian citizenship. I'm American, but she is not. But there's a wind that blows through the world that blows ambitious young people from the provinces, and love it though we do. Montreal is a provincial place. Towards the capital, whatever that capital is. It's like the beginning of the Three Musketeers when D'Artagnan is blown from Gascony to Paris, right? Or in pretty much all literature, Lost Illusions, Balzac's Lost Illusion begins. Boy, Lucien is blown from the provinces with his book of poems into Paris, and I think that it was just that inevitable drive rather than any specific ambition. Now I had a specific ambition, which was soon disappointed. I wanted to be a songwriter. I thought New York was the one place where I wanted to be on Broadway as in the song, and I had written the college show. That's kind of a tradition in American universities. You do a musical, and it was about the life of Vladimir Tatlin, the Russian constructivist architect, and the tragedy of Russian constructivism. And I was sure that was 6 weeks from Broadway, right? Who wouldn't want a Broadway musical about Russian constructivism and its tragedies? I mean, much more interesting than Phantoms and Operas or Les Miserables. I was wrong about that, and I never got that show off the ground. But certainly, if you want to be a songwriter, there's only one place to be.
Right, but I think something that people forget is that actually Donald Trump is a New Yorker.
Well, Donald Trump forgets, and New Yorkers try to forget that Donald Trump is a New Yorker because we don't want to claim him as our own. It's odd, actually. I didn't put it in the book because it sort of was outside the bounds of the storytelling I was doing. But when I worked as a youngster at GQ magazine, which was then called Gentleman's Quarterly and was much more narrowly a fashion magazine, anyway, transformed into what's called a general interest magazine, and we put, in I believe the spring of 1984, the young Donald Trump on the cover. And it's an ambiguous thing to celebrate in retrospect. At the time, Trump's particular brand of arrogance and brash indifference to the norms of civilized life seemed like something of I hesitate to say fresh air, but certainly like a new kind of wind that was blowing through New York at that time. You have to remember, New York in the 1970s had been a horribly depressed place. If you think of the great Martin Scorsese film Taxi Driver, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but New York is represented in that film as hell. Steam is coming out of the manholes, psychotics are driving all the cabs, the only place to go for a date is a pornographic film, and it all ends up with a gun massacre and a drug den, right? And that's very much how New York was perceived throughout the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, suddenly there was this efflorescence of capitalism, real estate, and money. And Trump seemed representative of that in a way that wasn't entirely pernicious, in a way that wasn't entirely evil, because it involved a certain kind of restorative energy in New York as well. Anyway, I'm ashamed to say we put him on the cover of the magazine and never anticipated what he would become.
Right, so on the subject of President Trump, so I think a lot of Americans, they ask this whenever they're abroad, what is going on?
I wish I had a good explanation for it. I will take Cassandra-like credit for having said early and often, not so much in the pages of the New Yorker as in the pixels of the New Yorker, because we now have a very aggressive online, NewYorker.com, and I write for it a great deal about political things. I had said that Trump was dangerous and very likely to win, and I said that for 2 years before he was elected, and it still seemed unlikely. And I thought that simply because reading history, you know that ethnic nationalism is an incredibly potent force when it's unleashed in the modern world. And I had seen that in France, where I lived for many years. I lived through most of the 1990s. I lived in France, and watching the rise of first Father Le Pen and then daughter Le Pen, had shown me that even in a wholly modern and progressive country, ethnic nationalism was incredibly powerful. And that was clearly what Trump was drawing on, was white ethnic nationalism in America. And that's what's going on, in a word. And the tragedy of the United States, I think, is that in France, just in the last election, the respectable conservatives, the respectable right, the Républicains, they change their name all the time, but it's the same sorting people, immediately rejected Le Pen, would not endorse an ethnic nationalist, and endorsed a centrist from a socialist background in preference. Recognizing, I think it was the experience of 1940 in Vichy that still fed that, recognizing that there are certain people you can't make peace with, you can't have a truce with. In America, just the opposite happened. The respectable conservative, excuse me, can I get a Kleenex? Forgive me, the respectable conservatives made their peace with Donald Trump, with the white ethnic nationalists, and thought that they could benefit from that alliance. And I suppose they are benefiting from that alliance politically. Mm-hmm. Thank you, dear. Forgive me, all those of you watching on Facebook. We'll see a man blow his nose, something never seen before on social media. But they thought that they could benefit from it, and as I say, I suppose they have benefited from it in short-term political terms. They get their Supreme Court justices and their tax cuts. But in the long run, it's insanely destructive of American democracy, and because American democracy is central to liberal democracy in the world, it's, I fear, insanely destructive of liberal democracy.
Right, so you've lived in France, and well, obviously
Canada.
now you live in you grew up in Canada, and now you live in the US, and now we're in London. So is there some kind of unifying factor between all the experiences that has happened? You talk about the French presidential election, you talk about Trump, but also we've had Brexit here in the UK, maybe nothing of equivalence in Canada, but you talk about these countries. Is there something going on that's transcending these?
Yes, I think so. That's the not merely the million, but the billion-dollar question of our time, right? What is happening in that way? All of those 4 countries you've mentioned, all were successful liberal democracies rising out of in some cases in France and Britain, out of the ruins and the ashes of the Second World War, in America and Canada, out of the triumphs of the Second World War, where we didn't have an experience of destruction. On the whole, it was an experience of emancipation, the Great Wars. And so that's a great question. There's a crisis of liberal democracy, clearly, and you're absolutely right to put Brexit is at the core of it. It's the same phenomenon. And clearly what's happened is, and this is the most self-evident and banal thing I can say, but it's true, is that we've been through a period of not just of globalization in some abstract sense, but of globalization in the immediate sense, that countries that were ethnically homogenous for a very long time, France and Britain, even a country like the United States, which has never been ethnically homogenous, but which had a kind of myth of ethnic homogeneity, if that makes any sense. In other words, what people who are called white people now are in fact Irish people and Jewish people and Scottish people and Italians and so on, people who never saw themselves as part of one ethnic mix until they suddenly felt threatened by a black president and by an illusion of a Muslim wave and the reality of a Hispanic presence, which goes all of those things coming together. Clearly, panic those people who feel themselves to be indigenous and endangered. And that's true in France, it's true here. There's no doubt in my mind that fear of immigration was a much more powerful force in Brexit, in the vote for Brexit, than hatred of the bureaucracy of Brussels. That's what we tell ourselves, but I don't think that's what it was. Same thing I think was very much true in America with the rise of Trump. We told ourselves, when I say we, I mean well-meaning East Coast liberals told themselves, oh, you have to understand it's all about the pathos of dislocated people who are suffering from a global economic crisis and feel themselves threatened, feel their livelihoods threatened in their small towns and their manufacturing cities and so on. That was nonsense. That was just nonsense. Those were not the people who voted for Trump. The people who voted for Trump cut across class barriers and cut across income barriers. What they didn't cut across was ethnic barriers. It was white people who voted for Trump. And white people, not all obviously, but that was essentially, Trump's vote was, like the Brexit vote, was an anti-immigrant vote. It was a tribal vote of people who felt themselves threatened with displacement. Bizarrely, in lots of ways, because Barack Obama, who seemed to most of us who were on the liberal side of things, or on somewhere on the broad left, seemed like a very mild, centrist, pragmatic, unthreatening, non-contentious figure, clearly was not perceived that way by that ethnic rump, so to speak. And you could see it. Trump came to notoriety and came eventually to power, not on a program of populist economics. That was a myth that those of us who wanted to empathize with his voters created. He rose on the wave of birtherism. Birtherism was flat out most racist, unapologetically racist belief that's ever been introduced into the mainstream of American politics.
Right. So clearly race has a big part to do with what we're seeing.
Right.
But so you've called Trump a white supremacist. So what does that say about your country? Is it a racist country?
No, I don't think it's a racist country. It's also a country that elected Barack Obama twice by much more generous margins than it elected Trump. Trump lost the election. He won the Electoral College. Obama won both elections he was in. So clearly it's not a racist country in some incurable or epidemic way. I very much part ways with my friend Ta-Nehisi Coates on that. Ta-Nehisi believes that it is an endemically and incurably racist country, and that Obama was a blip on the great screen of history, and I don't believe that's true at all. What it is, and this is where I think it connects with what's happening in France, what's happening in Eastern Europe, what's happening here, is that when the people feel their tribal identity much more powerfully than they feel any other thing. There's a great, though often overlooked, Hungarian-American historian named John Lukács, not to be confused with George Lukács from an earlier generation. And Lukács's point in all of his histories is that the great force of modernity is nationalism. It's not socialism, it's not capitalism, it's nationalism. And that any time you have a conflict between nationalism and some other force, nationalism wins. Gives the example of, and I've written about this, at the time of the First World War, when every optimistic socialist assumed that there would be greater solidarity between the German working class and the British working class and the French working class than there would be collaboration between the German working class and German nationalists. They were wrong. And they've been wrong again and again. Nationalism, that kind of tribalism, is an incredibly powerful force. And so for those in quotes, white Americans who felt themselves threatened by what was happening, Trump was a solution. It was a way of expressing, and it's not racist in the sense that I think it's directed against black people particularly or against Hispanics. It's directed against a more broadly defined other. It's the people who you feel are threatening you. It's why, for instance, that fear of terrorism is so powerful in that potion, even though, in fact, in America, the people who are voting for Trump, and if you see how they rate worries about terrorism high on their list of things. It is zero possibility of ever encountering terrorism in their lives. In New York City, where we have an actual possibility of encountering terrorism, it rates very low, and people overwhelmingly voted against Trump. But it's clearly not an actual fear of actual terrorism. It's a generalized fantasy fear that's about the encroaching other who's going to take your birthright from you.
Right. On that topic of the encroaching other, so you've talked about how the present day situation we're in now has similarities with Orwell's 1984, and we all know that after Trump got elected, that it shot up to the top of the
exactly.
bestsellers.
Right.
But actually, in one of your earlier articles, you actually said that you were never a big fan of the book.
No, what did Keynes say? When the facts change, my opinions change. The facts in the world change. I had never been a big Orwellian in that way for a couple of reasons. One was I'd always thought that 1984 was too narrowly dystopian a vision, and that it projected forward the outlines of Stalinist Russia into the future in a way that was a little mechanical. But when I went to reread the book in the light of Trump being elected, I thought that there was something much deeper going on that Orwell had spotted and detected, and that is the sheer power of lies to annihilate the truth if they're told often enough and relentlessly enough. And that it was possible to have an authoritarian ideology that had no utopian element to it at all. We think of the great totalitarian and authoritarian, I'm not sure there's that significant a difference between the two, ideologies of the 20th century as having had some residual utopianism in them, Marxism most famously. But even the far-right ideologies, however horrific their utopianism was, were about building the better place. Trump is purely the ideology of power. It could not be more brutally clear. It's simply an ideology of personal domination over his enemies and ethnic domination over this encroaching other. And I think Orwell was very smart about that to see, because that's what the final climax of 1984 is when O'Brien, the inner party member, explains to Winston, the end of power is power. The end of power is not, we'll make a better world, but eggs will be broken along the way. The point of it is to break the eggs. And I think that that's something we're seeing in a terribly palpable way in the States now.
But isn't the people who voted for Trump, people who voted for Brexit, people who are supporting Le Pen in France, aren't they also expressing the powerlessness that they feel? That they feel like the establishment, the liberal elites, have deserted them in the name of globalization, of neoliberalism. So you talk about power, but isn't there also the powerless who are a big part of the story as well?
To be both obstinate and obnoxious. That's the story we tell ourselves, but I don't think it's the truth. I don't think it's the true story. In other words, again, when you look at the people who voted for Trump, it's not the dispossessed who are voting for Trump. It's not the impoverished who are voting for Trump. It's well-off people who vote for Trump, people who are benefiting perfectly well from the current dispensation, but who feel that their identity is being threatened by it. In other words, we like to say, it's the pathos of the powerless that drives far right-wing ethnic nationalism forward. People say the same thing. Let's going to the ultimate source about the rise of Hitler. It was an expression of the inflation and the panics of Weimar. But in truth, those things were largely past by the time Hitler came to power, right? And nothing dislodged Hitler from power in the way of you bombed Germany to smithereens and he was still popular. I think that's too. Those of us who have been raised in a progressive tradition believe in economic causes. We say, if there's something bad happens in the world, it's because someone's being deprived of economic opportunity or economic power. I have a darker view of the world. I think that the default condition of mankind tends to be ethnic and tribal warfare, and that it takes an incredible historical mechanism to get people to not to think solely in those terms, and that it's treacherously easy once someone gives you permission to see the world in those terms, to see it in those terms again. And that's what Trump is good at. He gives his supporters not an explanation for the world, he gives them a license to express their most fundamental bigotries and fears in what suddenly becomes an acceptable way. So I know that we're supposed to say that this is the rise of the powerless and the disempowered and the former people whose lives have been disrupted by globalization. But when you look at the facts, that doesn't seem to be what explains it. If that were true, then you would see people who have suffered most in the neoliberal collapse post-2008, as we sometimes call it. You'd see that those people were the ones who were most prey to vote for what we call economic populism. But those aren't the people who end up voting for it. The poor blacks and poor Hispanics in the States who have suffered disproportionately in the last Great Depression, Great Recession, they vote uniformly for Hillary. They voted uniformly for Hillary Clinton. They don't perceive their interests as being aligned with economic populism against, for good, what we call, for good or ill, globalization or anything else. They tend to see globalization as a positive thing because that's their background in lots of ways. I think, I genuinely believe, and I know that I'm in a minority in believing this, but I believe it anyway, that that we fool ourselves because we want to believe that. We want to believe that because if that's true, then the cure, if it's true that this is a revolt of the powerless who have been cheated by the neoliberal planetary dispensation post 1989, then there's a progressive solution to the problem. Historically, I don't think that's been proven to be true. I think it's a much deeper issue.
Right. So it becomes a more tractable problem.
Yes.
When it's, or you could say, when the narrative is that we just need to give them more money.
In plain English, yes, exactly.
But so if you're right, then it's a much bigger problem, much more difficult to solve, which is some intrinsic ethnic, tribal conflict that is driving all these things we're seeing. So then what is your solution?
I don't have one.
Okay.
I don't have one. But I do think, for me, the wisest book ever written about human politics still was written in the depths of the Second World War, in exile in New Zealand, by a man who worked here at London School of Economics, Karl Popper. Mm-hmm. And Popper's central insight, which stretched out from Plato through Hegel, through Marx, through Hitler, was that there's a perpetual conflict in human affairs between closed and open societies, and that the appeal, and at any moment when a society begins to become open, plural, cosmopolitan, inclusive, tolerant of opposing views, the pull backwards, the magnetic pull backwards towards a closed society will be incredibly powerful. And he understood that, tragically, Socrates in ancient Greece represented that pull, but Plato did, pull back towards a closed authoritarian society, the spell of an unanxious solution. We could dissolve all of our social anxieties if we had one fixed authority. And I think that's true. And I think that there's a perpetual warfare between open societies and closed societies. Historically, closed societies almost always have won. The periods of human existence when open societies have flourished are tragically brief. And I think we're engaged in that same perpetual warfare today.
Right. So you cite Popper as one of your biggest influences. And obviously, of course, he taught here, he founded our philosophy departments.
Yes.
So we talked about Popper and Orwell, but so in just this week you had a debate about the merits of 1984 versus another very famous dystopian novel, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So do you see any similarities there between that dystopian novel and what we're seeing today?
Well, I always have loved Huxley's writing. Huxley was a much better writer than Orwell was. Orwell has the virtues of simplicity and lucidity and clarity, but he didn't have a fertile imagination, really. Huxley had an incomparably fertile imagination, and when you read Brave New World now, I had to argue for Orwell, but if I were giving a wholly honest report, I think Huxley has it for imagination. He saw things like the possibility of in vitro fertilization and genetic engineering and things that were quite astonishing to imagine in 1931. And I think it's still true, though not as true as it was 5 years ago, or at the turn of the millennium even more, that we live in a society devoted in many ways to hedonistic pursuits and material pleasure, and that's one of the drugs, the opiates in our society is that we can delude ourselves that we're pursuing freedom when we're simply pursuing fetishized goods. So I admire all of that in Huxley enormously. I think that Popper and Orwell were writing at the same time in the 40s and I think that Popper, being much more philosophically sophisticated and alert than Orwell was, saw, I think, that if I can put it this way, Orwell's mistake in 1984, I couldn't say this the other night, but I'll say it now, was to simply project forward the style and the shape of Soviet totalitarianism onto the future. in Soviet totalitarianism, Stalinism was a very specific thing that came out of the impoverishment of the Soviet Union and and the war and many other things. But I think, and what I think Popper spotted is, any time we don't recognize how fragile liberal civilization is, and that the fragility of liberal civilization was enormous. And I think Popper also understood, and this is where he became, I think, a truly great philosopher, the connection between scientific method and scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and liberal revolution and liberal societies, that those two things were deeply linked. And I think one of the great questions for our time is whether those two things can be uncoupled. In other words, whether it's possible to have a society that's technologically very... Popper thought you couldn't have a society that was scientific, science-based, that had growing scientific knowledge, that didn't have a traditional political liberty. Those two things were deeply allied in his mind. But now we're seeing that seems to be quite possible, just as we're seeing that it's possible to have free markets without civil freedoms, without accompanying civil freedoms. So those basic premises of liberalism, I think, are under assault now in a very specific and significant way.
That's a very interesting question, because I think a lot of people will look at the United States and think, well, this is a technologically very prosperous country. They've invented all these mega companies originate from Silicon Valley, but then you also have this great portion of your society who don't believe in man-made climate change, for example. So how do you square these two things, where you kind of have widespread scientific literacy, or so we think, but then also this exceptionally, amongst advanced democracies, exceptionally illiterate portion of your society?
How can the society be so smart and so stupid at the same time?
Right, I think that's the question.
Is the question you're asking. Well, some of it is regional, I might add. If you hived off California and New York, and if you hived off the area from New York to Massachusetts, and then California, you'd have a very different country than the rest of the country. And the things you're talking about, the high-tech stuff and all of that, tends to be concentrated in those parts of the country. The United States is a country that had an unsettled civil war. I see you've got one of my other books there, an old book of mine, Angels and Ages, which is a short book about Darwin, Lincoln, and modern life. And I intended that as an ironic subtitle because I wanted everyone to say, how can you possibly write a short book? Ho, 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 write a short book about... Nobody understood that it was ironic. Everyone thought, oh, he's written a short book about Darwin, Lincoln, and modern life. And that book is very much about the coming of the Civil War and part of those sections on Lincoln. And the truth is that we had an unsettled Civil War. We fought a Civil War, but we didn't have a real resettlement of the politics. What you had was a reimposition of apartheid through terror in the American South, and we still haven't resolved that side of things. So if you see right now, 2 weeks from now in Alabama, we're likely to have a confessed child molester elected because at least he's not soft on the blacks. That's the basic underlying reality of politics in the American South. So we have lots of specific and contingent issues, but on a large scale, you said a moment ago, well, we haven't had in Canada that kind of right-wing ethnic nationalist response, but we did actually. People just don't remember it because it was Canadian, but the mayor of Toronto, the greatest city in Canada, the greatest city is Montreal, but the biggest city in Canada, and the most cosmopolitan city I have ever been in, a city that is equally welcoming to Somalians and Serbs, and is the most cosmopolitan city imaginable. The mayor of Toronto for several years was a pure Donald Trump figure named Rob Ford, who represented exactly on a municipal scale that rejection on the part essentially of the suburban, ethnic, semi-rural whites of Toronto who were incorporated into the city, of all the Somalians and the Serbs and everybody else who was pouring into the city. So on a microscopic level, or microcosmic level, we've had exactly the same phenomenon in Canada. Just was Canadian, so nobody paid attention to it. But I don't know if you remember Rob Ford. He was the one who was eventually was found smoking crack on tape. And presumably there may be a similar kind of tape of Trump that may finally be discussed, but it was exactly the same. It was exactly the same political phenomenon. But how can a country as rich in intelligence as the United States be as poverty-stricken at the same time in intelligence? Yeah, as I say, I think there's specific historical and contingent forces on it. And then I think, and here I am sort of, and it comes back to the subject of my new book about the 1980s, inequality is a very noxious thing. My parents' generation, I'm going to reduce things to anecdotes, but anecdotes sometimes are illuminating. My parents' generation, coming out of the Second World War, their parents basically fought or worked through the Second World War. And they came of age at a time in the 1950s and 1960s when the myths of opportunity were not myths, they were real things. My grandparents barely spoke English or just spoke it well enough, could hardly read it. And both my parents went on to become college professors. They went to good universities and they got advanced degrees and they went on to become linguists and professors and enabled me to talk to you today about these things. That wasn't a myth, that was a real possibility of every kind of social intellectual advancement through education. And that was the core American belief that you had equality of opportunity to education, anybody could take advantage of. As universities have become more and more exclusive and expensive, that becomes much, much harder to enforce. As the educational divide, the educational sorting becomes more powerful, now it's still that myth is not a myth for many people. People arrive from the dry cleaner who works across the street from where I live in New York City, arrived from Korea, not speaking a word of English 25 years ago, and her 2 kids are going to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology,
wow.
Right? So it's not impossible, but it becomes rarer. And that general accepted sense that there is an access to social advancement through education, which has to be the core belief of democracy, has been terribly degraded by the things that happened beginning in the 1980s when you first began to get this great when inequality began to assert itself on a previously unimaginable scale. And that, I think, is core to what's happened since.
So we've covered a lot of topics, and I'm aware of time, so I just want to turn to the final thing that I really want to talk about, which is writing. So we publish, most of our articles are written, and actually we're one of the kind of rare student societies that still do these kind of things, which is write articles. So do you think that, first I wanted to ask you, what made you want to become a writer in the first place?
I never can remember not wanting to be a writer. It's sort of the reverse, in other words, don't remember choosing to be a writer, I can't remember not wanting to write. Right. I love to read, and that's all my sort of key, I don't want to say my key sensual experiences in life have all been reading. That would sound too pathetic for a writer. But certainly I was one of those kids who found a solace in reading that nothing else in the world supplied. So once whether it was reading Tolkien and living for 6 months in Middle Earth, or reading Pickwick Papers and living for 2 months in Victorian England, I love to read. And when you love to read, it's hard to imagine doing anything but write, because you want to write the books you wanted to read when you were younger. So I love writing as an extension of the fact that I love reading. And I think that it's pretty hard not to be a writer if you're not a reader in the first instance. What was the next one? What was the? I forgot.
I think my final question would be: so, do you have any advice, books you recommend for people who want to be writers, or maybe you don't think people should become writers? Because actually, that's what a lot of people are saying now, which is that print journalism, newspaper journalism is dying, and that maybe there's because you actually say in Angels and Ages, which is that the dominant medium of our time is images.
I do say that, don't I?
Yes, you do.
It's terrifying. I have an optimistic view of writing, though a pessimistic view of publishing. Maybe that's a way of putting it. It's never been easier to be a writer than it is now. It's never been harder to be a professional writer, to make your living as a writer. I think that people's appetite for reading is as great now as it's ever been. It's not evenly distributed across the entire society. I was on a plane coming here to London, and I was struck and startled and worried by the fact that I didn't see anybody reading a book except me on the plane, right? But people were consulting their devices and they were reading their Kindles, I'm sure. And the technology changes, but the technique of mind doesn't so much. I see writing springing up all around me, and I see it. The internet is in the first instance, though we're doing it visually today. In the first instance, it's a writing medium. That's what that's email and texting and blogging and Vox and Vice and BuzzFeed. Those are all written medium. I mean, they do video as well, but they're about writing in lots of ways. So I think there's as much appetite for writing now as there's ever been. I think that finding ways, this is commonplace, but it's true, to monetize it. We've seen the breakdown of newspapers that could pay people living wages and sometimes extravagant wages, and even in this country, and that part of it is a huge problem. If it's of any kind of minimal comfort, if you look at the history of the written word, you see, in the printed word, I suppose I should say, you see that there are crucial moments when there's a disconnect between the amount of writing that gets done and the amount of money writers get. So one of my heroes is Samuel Johnson, right? Dr. Johnson from London, lived not far from here. And when he arrived in London as a would-be young writer, there were a million places to write for a penny a line, but you ended up sleeping on the street. And that's what he did with his friend Richard Savage. He slept on the streets. He had plenty of places to write. It's just like the internet, right? Plenty of places to write. No one would pay you a living wage to write. Over his lifetime, that got, if not cured, then altered by subscriptions and the growth of the bourgeois audience for periodical literature and so on. And I suspect something like that may happen in the next 30 or 40 years in terms of how the internet begins to translate words into coins. But I think that writing is as important as it's ever been. I think that eloquence matters. That's what Angels and Ages is all about. But what's the nature of liberal eloquence, by which I mean an eloquence that speaks to a democratic society rather than just to an elite society. And I use both Darwin and Lincoln as masters of that kind of eloquence. It's an eloquence rooted in empiricism, in respect for fact, and I use both Darwin and Lincoln are hugely inspiring figures in that way. Lincoln, people tend to forget, argued the way a lawyer argues, and right throughout and up to the end of the Civil War, meaning that he argued coolly, rationally, even when he was engaged in one of the great conflicts in human history. For me, Darwin's first two chapters of Darwin's Origin of Species is one of the great documents of persuasion that's ever been written, because Darwin has the single hardest case to make in the history of mankind. He's going to dislodge man from the center of the universe. And he does it not with rhetorical overkill, but just saying, look at how dogs and pigeons get bred in London by Cockney dog and pigeon breeders, and you'll see that you can make fantastic changes in animals, in animal life, just through small directional changes in breeding. And the whole argument for vision of life over a billion years rests on just pay attention to what pigeon fanciers do and what dog breeders do. It's a fantastic piece of persuasion. So I believe in persuasion through empiricism. I believe in argument through fact, and I think an argument through fact can only happen in literature, it can only happen through extension, it can only happen through extended argument. And in all those ways, I think that writing is as essential now as it's ever been. We've been talking today about the illnesses of our time, which are real and pandemic. But the antidotes to the illnesses will only be arrived at when we stop to think. It's beautiful. If I can now escape from the elitist world of Darwin and Lincoln to one of my favorite songwriters, Sting. Sting has a beautiful song called "All This Time," and if you remember, the key line is how does it go exactly? Men go crazy in congregations. They only get better one by one. That's true.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for your time. The book is At the Stranger's Gate. It's a fantastic read. Highly recommend it. It's in all good bookstores everywhere. Adam Gopnik, thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here, Dallas.